Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my definitive review of the Canon RF 15-35mm F2.8L IS USM. Now, this is, of course, one of the very important zoom lenses on Canon, and helps to, kind of complete that trinity of wide aperture primes. We have the 15-35mm, the 24-70mm, and the 70-200mm. That really, these zooms become the staple of journalists, wedding photographers, portrait photographers, and of course, a lens like this is going to be very popular with those that do landscapes and astrophotography and various things like that. So obviously a crucial lens for Canon to get right. And for a long time, this is the kind of lens that Canon really didn't get right. And while lenses like their 16 to 35mm f2.8, Mark I and Mark II, those lenses were obviously popular because they were pro-grade zooms and very necessary, there was a lot of complaints about them and their performance, and of course, corners that never really got sharp and things like that. And when I went back and tested the 16 to 35mm f2.8L Mark II, I was relatively unimpressed because by that point Canon had produced the 16 to 35mm f4 IS lens, and of course Tamron had out the 15 to 30mm f2.8 VC that gave you stabilization and the wider maximum aperture, and so that older lens just didn't really hold up as well. Then of course Canon released the Mark III of that lens, which improved a lot of things and made it a lot more competitive. Fast forward, however, to the RF mount and Canon's, new EOS R. It opened up a lot of new possibilities for Canon in terms of lens development, with a brand new lens mount, better communication, a little bigger, diameter of the lens mount. And as a byproduct of that, we were able to get a little bit wider focal length, 15mm rather than 16mm, but always before you had to choose either between the larger maximum aperture of f2.8 or having image stabilization. But now we not only got that bigger focal range, zoom range, but we also got the combination of the wider maximum aperture and an effective image stabilizer on top of that. And so in many ways, you got kind of the benefit of the Tamron 15 to 30mm, howbeit with a larger zoom range. And on top of that, Canon managed to do it where they retained, typical threaded filters on the front instead of a bulbous front element. And so in many ways, they kind of gave us the best of what was offered by various parties before and put it all into one lens. And so in many ways, it feels like you gave up little and you gained a lot. Now today we're doing our definitive review, so we're going to be hitting a lot of the details of performance and handling along the way. And so if you don't want all of those details, you might want to check out the standard review instead. It'll be a little bit quicker and to the point, and to just kind of hit the highlights. And if that's more your cup of tea, we'll take a look at that. But if you want all the details, you're in the right place. We're going to start by taking a closer look at the build, the features, the handling of the lens, and so we'll dive in and take a look at that together. So first of all, my first impression upon receiving this lens is that, wow, it is big. And certainly when you become more accustomed to mirrorless lenses that tend to be a little more compact, this lens does not leave you feeling like it is particularly compact. That being said, however, back in the day, I've spent a lot of time using the Tamron 15 to 30mm f2.8 VC and then the GT2 version of that lens. And all things considered, this lens is actually considerably smaller than that, despite having both an expanded zoom range. Instead of 15 to 30, we've got 15 to 35mm. And on top of that, it has an image stabilizer, which the Tamron did as well. But what we've also got is traditional filter threads here and an 82mm filter thread size, which is big, but certainly not uncommon these days. And so with all things considered, I think that this lens is not overly sized for what you're getting here. So you will note that it is not an internally zooming lens. There is a mild amount of zoom action taking place, and it is at its longest at the 15mm position, and it will actually completely lock in somewhere between 28 and 35mm in terms of its length. Now we have got a flow here for the 3 rings here, and so between the actual zoom ring and then the focus ring, there is very, very little seam. You're probably not going to feel that difference much by feel. You'll have to just kind of learn muscle memory if you actually are going to manually focus as to where that manual focus ring is located. We've got the control ring up near the front, and of course that has a completely different texture to it, you know, kind of the unique control ring diamond pattern, and so that's a much easier to find by feel, obviously. On the actual barrel itself, we have got 2 switches. One is the AF/MF switch, the other is the stabilizer on and off. I have read a few complaints that they find that these flush switches like this are a little bit, because there's not a lot of pressure on them, it can be possible to inadvertently turn off the stabilizer. You know, your mileage may vary on that. I did just want to note what I had seen others say. Our lens hood here is much like the 16-35 series in the past. It's really so small as to, there's no way that that is providing a whole lot of shading, but what you may get here obviously is more of a protection value, to where when it's popped in place, you know, you may, you know, take some bumps on the lens hood that might otherwise be transferred onto the front element. Up front, you do have a flooring coating on that front element. There are weather seals throughout the lens itself. This is definitely a pro-grade lens. And while it is that engineered plastic shell, my experience with Canon's lenses like this is this is going to be tough and durable for the long haul. Now, what we have found, if we compare it to the most recent 16-35mm F2.8L, which was the Mark III, is that in terms of the physicality, we have quite a similar sized lens. This lens is actually a tiny bit smaller. I mean, and when I say tiny bit, I mean tiny bit. We're talking about, it is 88.5 millimeters in diameter, which is identical with the previous lens, but it is 126.8 millimeters in length instead of 127.5 millimeters. So you're literally talking about a millimeter difference. That being said, the new lens is heavier. It is 840 grams or 1.85 pounds versus 790 grams. And so we've got 50 grams of additional weight. This lens does feel quite dense. And so you certainly probably are going to feel the weight in operation, but it is lighter than what, say, the Tamron lens was. That Tamron lens was a little bit wider in diameter, but it was 145 millimeters in length, so about 19 millimeters or so longer. And it weighed in at 1,110 grams, and so obviously significantly heavier than this lens, about 250 grams. And so, you know, obviously that's progress on that front. 9 rounded aperture blades inside, pretty standard stuff. Obviously it does have image stabilizer. 16 elements in 12 groups make up the optical formula, and it does have a useful 0.21 times magnification, and you'll get that at its closest focus distance of 28 centimeters, or right at about 11 inches. And so, you know, a versatile lens in terms of our focal length, going from very wide to, you know, 35 millimeters is, you know, starting into the normal range. And so a useful focal length, and obviously useful to be able to use traditional screw-on filters instead of, you know, a much more expensive front filter system or a less flexible rear filter system. In terms of the price point, this lens is got a hefty price, as have many of these RF lenses. You're looking at $2,300 US, so about $100 premium over the 16-35 millimeter. You know, that's pretty easy to justify. You're getting an extra millimeter of width, you know, and not really losing anything. However, the Tamron G2 lens, you know, if you're looking at a comparison to the 16-35 on a DSLR mount, and of course you can still use that Tamron via adapter on RF, it clocks into $1,200 US, and so $1,100 cheaper. So that's going to be kind of, I think, the big potential deal breaker for some people. It's just a lot of money for some people to stomach paying for a wide-angle lens for their new Canon mirrorless camera. And so, I mean, the takeaway here is, as I said in my intro, you really gave up little and you gained a lot. The lens isn't really physically larger than the 16 to 35 millimeter, but you've managed to gain an extra millimeter of focal length on the wide end, which is huge, and you've managed to pack in an image stabilizer there. And so Canon has managed to really give us more for our money, in essence, here. And, you know, while this lens is $100 more expensive than what the 16 to 35 millimeter Mark III is currently retailing at, I think that most people would agree that getting both a wider focal length and also getting image stabilizer for $100 is probably a pretty fair trade-off, all things considered. And of course, this is not just an image stabilizer, this is a very effective one. In the first generation of Tamron's 15 to 30 millimeter VC, you got a stabilizer that had a real-world stabilization of 2 to 2.5 stops. That did improve in their G2 version of the lens, but here you're getting a stabilizer that's rated at 5 stops, which is very, very impressive. And when you pair it with, you know, a camera like the new EOS R5 or R6, you are actually getting 7 stops of combined hand-holding capability between the in-body image stabilization and the lens image stabilization. And so as you can see here, while it's not quite gimbal smooth, it's quite effective for even walking, which I find to be really the most challenging thing for any image stabilizer. And if you're just doing like small pans up or down, you know, less complex movement, I find that it works, you know, fairly similarly to a gimbal on my EOS R5. And so really impressive when it comes to the capabilities of that. So let's talk about autofocus for a moment. Canon put their Nano USM autofocus system in this lens. And so Nano USM, it's not a ring type USM, but rather it's more like linear motors is what it's branded in some other manufacturers. And so it's a smaller focus motor that works, you know, well for mirrorless applications because it's nice and smooth for video applications. It is nice and fast, particularly in a lens like this where there's less demands on the system. And so I would say that in most situations, I find autofocus to be near instantaneous and fairly quiet in operation. But as we're going to see in our video focus pulls test here in just a second, it's not completely silent. Let's take a look. So you can hear a little bit of clicking there. And in fact, you know, if you put your ear close during even normal focus, you'll hear just a little of that noise that is there. But overall, it's quite quiet. And under normal circumstances, when you're actually doing video and not doing major pulls, it actually stays quiet enough that, you know, for example, let me just demonstrate the lens for vlogging, you know, another aspect where this lens is proven quite popular. The 15 to 35 millimeter is also proven to be a popular option for those who like to vlog and want to share every part of their lives because it has a wide enough focal length in the EOS R days to overcome the big crop factor. And of course now on the EOS R5 you have a lot more flexibility. You can just zoom a bit if you want that crop factor, or if you want you can actually go into APS-C mode. And so while there's more options, it remains probably one of the best lenses on the platform for vlogging. And so as far as autofocus goes, you see that it did a great job of tracking my face and my eye in that kind of situation. But also you'll note that, you know, where there is some environmental sound, even using the onboard microphone, I didn't have a problem with picking up any kind of focus sound as a part of that. And in my video clips, I also did not have an issue with that. Even as focus changes were being made, as long as there is some kind of environmental noise, I think that you won't have a problem with even the onboard microphone picking up a lot of focus sound. So how about the image quality? I mean, this is not an inexpensive lens. This is an expensive lens at basically $2,300 US, and here in Canada, it's well more than $3,000. And so it's a significant investment. And so you need to get some good image quality out of that. So let's take a look and break down in detail how the image quality holds up from this particular lens. So first of all, let's take a look at Vignette and Distortion here. And so starting at 15 millimeters, you can see that we do have a fair amount of barrel distortion. Pattern is reasonably linear, and although it doesn't correct perfectly, as you can see as far as the geometry, if you're doing a manual type correction. The bigger problem, however, has been a trend that I've seen with Canon's wide-angle lenses, and that is a fairly extreme amount of vignette. So much so that if you're trying to manually correct for that, you see I've got the sliders at the two extremes, but you can see that there remains some significant darkening in the extreme corners. And so this is an amount of vignette that is outside of the range, essentially, for correcting for in any kind of organic way in Lightroom. And so obviously that is a significant factor. So if you use the just correction profile here in Lightroom, you can see that that correction is still imperfect as far as the vignette goes, and you can try to increase the percentage of the vignette here and you can get it to a better place, but you can see that the vignette is just so strong in the extreme corners that it never quite corrects perfectly. Now, the standard profile does a pretty good job of correcting the distortion, as you can see, and so certainly a better result on that front. Now on the other end at 35 millimeters, you can see that the distortion type has switched to a pincushion distortion. It is easier to correct, obviously, overall, and you can see that vignette is still heavy, but within the range of basically correctability by doing a manual correction. And so less of an overall issue, but at 15 millimeters, we have got an extreme amount of vignette. So this gives you an idea of what's available to you as far as that focal range. 15 millimeters gives you a very wide framing, and obviously 35 millimeters gives you a much tighter framing. And so quite a variety of ways of approaching any particular scene due to that very flexible zoom range. So obviously my testing standards have now changed with Canon's release of the EOS R5. And so in this case, we actually do have obviously much more resolution on tap, about 50% more resolution. So that does add some, extra stresses upon lenses in terms of their overall resolution performance. So taking a quick look, in a vacuum, so to speak, here at a 1:1 pixel level, we can see a pretty good center resolution, not mind-blowing contrast, however. Mid-frame resolution is pretty decent. As you can see here, fairly consistent. You're starting to lose a little towards the bottom right corner. And as we come down here, a usable amount of resolution in the extreme corners. Now, I do like to have some kind of benchmark, and obviously there isn't a lot of wide-angle options to benchmark here. However, I do happen to have the Samyang 14mm f2.8 autofocus lens, and so it does give us a benchmark. And so we're going to go in a little bit further to a 2:1 pixel level and get some comparison here. So we can see that the prime delivers ever so slightly more contrast and roughly similar amounts of resolution in the middle of the frame. Mid-frame here, the prime gives us a little bit better in results, and you can see that contrast is definitely better. And if we scroll down to the $2 bill here, we can see that there's just a little bit more contrast punch there. But if we go towards the corners, the zoom lens actually has a bit of an advantage, a little bit better contrast and definitely a little stronger resolution into the extreme corner. That's also true if we pop up into the upper left corner here as well. What we can see as far as the zoom goes is that we've got fairly good centering, a fairly even performance on either corner. So if we stop down to f4, we see only a minor improvement in terms of contrast. The whites have gotten a little bit brighter, dark's just a little bit darker. You can see a little improvement here in the text there, but we're not looking at any kind of massive improvement here as of yet. And we can see, looking here at the $2 bill, that things are more similar than different down into the corner. A little bit more contrast, resolution results are more similar than different. Now the jump from f4 to f5.6 gives us a more significant improvement in terms of contrast and resolution. Now our corner performance is pretty good. Jumping back to the center for the second, you can see that contrast and resolution have punched up enough to where we're starting to see just the faintest amount of a moire pattern here that speaks of a much higher resolving of detail. Now if we jump back to comparison with the Samyang for a second, we see that I now favor the Canon ever so slightly in the center of the frame. A little better result there. Mid-frame, I like up in this area. I like the prime lens Samyang a little bit better. I like its contrast a little bit stronger here. Looking at the $2 bill, pretty similar in terms of the end result. Samyang a little bit better here towards the corner. And as we move down here towards the edge, however, we can see that at the extreme, I still prefer the Canon zoom result. And up in this upper corner, you can see that that's still the case, that the Canon delivers the stronger results right out towards the edge of the frame. One thing that is worth noting, however, is that the Canon shows just a little bit of a lateral chromatic aberration. As you can see a little bit of purple and green fringing there, whereas the prime lens is more neutral in terms of the colors there, and so less lateral CA. Peak edge performance comes somewhere around f8. As you can see, lots of pop here, lots of detail there. And so if you're kind of wanting to shoot maximum performance aperture for landscapes, f8 is probably going to be that aperture. Minimum aperture is f22, and so if we go from our peak at f8 to f22, you can see that diffraction is really starting to impact the image, and of course with a higher resolution body like this, diffraction sets in earlier and has a greater impact. And so I would avoid the smaller apertures, and you might want to prefer to do something like a focus stacking technique if absolutely necessary. Now if we move on to 20 millimeters, you can see that wide open we have a fairly similar result to 15 millimeters. However, what I am seeing is a much faster performance increase if you stop down to f4, for example. You can see that contrast and detail in the center of the frame have vastly improved quickly. That's true here mid-frame, and also true, though to a lesser degree, down in the corner. Stopping down to f5.6 doesn't really give us a significant corner improvement, and even at f8, but maybe not as optimized for corner performance as what we saw at 15 millimeters. Now if we move on to 24 millimeters, we've got a better starting performance at f2.8, and stop down to f4 in the center of the frame. We now see exceptional results with that moire pattern starting to begin there, and a really good contrast and detail on the text. Similarly, our mid-frame result at f4 looks fantastic. We can see likewise at the bottom of the frame, contrast and resolution really good, and extending towards that right lower corner, and we can also see a stronger edge performance here as well. And so if you're wanting to shoot more in the middle of the range, I would prefer 24 millimeters over 20 millimeters to get kind of peak performance. By f5.6 we're getting fairly strong corner performance, and f8 looks fairly excellent in terms of contrast and resolution. Now if we move on to 35 millimeters, we see that Canon has done a good job of extending a fairly comparable performance throughout the zoom range. I would say in some ways, as far as the corners, the weakest being at 20 millimeters, but center performance is fairly consistent. We see once again at 35 millimeters stopping down to f4, quickly improves contrast and resolution in the center of the frame. Mid-frame isn't quite as strong as what we saw at the 24 millimeter zone, but looking fairly good by f4. Now what we can see in the corner is that our just overall acuity isn't as high. The details aren't as finely rendered here. Stopping down to f5.6 improves contrast a bit, but you can see that the details here are not being rendered with a lot of precision. Stepping on down to f8 does improve things a fair bit. Not exceptional levels here, but I think that at f8 you'll get nice consistent results across the frame. Now while we have seen that there is a bit of lateral chromatic aberration, what we can see here is that longitudinal chromatic aberrations are actually really well controlled. And so you can see a little bit of evidence of the lateral CA, but almost no evidence of the longitudinal, no purple before the plane of focus, and no green fringing after the plane of focus. So if we go to the minimum focus, we can see we have a reasonably good 0.21 times magnification, but we can see that your plane of focus is going to have to be quite careful because you can see that very quickly sharpness drops off. It's not a very flat plane of focus here. In the center of the frame, you know, sharpness and contrast are fairly good here, but if you get off center, as we're going to see, you lose that very quickly. And so not a lot of flexibility in terms of your composition. Here, for example, you know, more of a, you know, kind of rule of thirds type composition. You can see that, you know, it's not particularly impressive in terms of the detail that's rendered there. We can also see, at least in this situation, that the bokeh is a little bit busy. Here's another situation to where we're not too far from the center of the frame, but neither am I particularly impressed with the contrast that is there. Detail's not too bad, but it could use a contrast boost. And as we can see, there certainly are wide-angle lenses that have nicer quality of bokeh blur. This one is, I think, tends towards the busy side. Now the real strength of this lens, of course, is as a landscape lens if you're using it for stills, and so we can see that we have, you know, nice detail, nice color across the frame, shooting at smaller apertures like f5.6 here. You can see a nice consistency of the real world result. Everywhere I look, detail looks good, color looks very nice. In this case, I've, you know, tweaked the tone curve a little bit just to suit the mood of the image. But you're going to find similar kind of results here. I think that there's good detail and there's good contrast throughout the image. As I look up here, looking kind of for real-world lateral chromatic aberration, I see a little bit of green and purple fringing, but not to any kind of extreme or destructive level. I don't think that too many people are going to have too many real-world issues with that. And looking back at the image, you know, globally, I like it. Now in my real-world results, I saw fairly decent flare resistance results, which of course is incredibly important in a wide-angle lens. The wider the lens, the more likely the sun or some other source of bright light is going to be in the frame. And so we can see a minor ghosting pattern here, but no major discoloration elsewhere. You can also get a look at the 18-pointed sun star here that comes from, you know, a 9 aperture blade count. Now in this case, shooting at closer to minimum focus distances with very bright light coming through, you can see again, just a minor little ghosting artifact here. Contrast is held up reasonably well, just a little bit of, you know, shadow lift taking place. In this case, the bokeh is a little bit more pleasing to me than some of those other images, and so a pretty good, again, performance against bright lights. In this case, you know, the sun is less extreme, and I think that the sunburst effect looks nice. And this to me is the kind of image that I think that this lens really excels at. It just, you know, it's nice and detailed, and then that sunburst effect, having a pleasing effect, is a nice addition. Now, starting with the 16-35L Mark III, I felt like Canon was doing a better job with chroma performance with its wide-angle zooms, and that continues, fortunately, to be the trend here. And so, as you can see, you can get some nice night sky end results. I've got my barrel sauna here, and then the Milky Way beyond. Here, just so we can look a little bit more critically, you can see just stars. And so we do have a tiny bit of stretching here. It's a 20-second exposure, so we have just a tiny bit of star movement. And so, but what we can see is that in the center of the frame, everything's nice and crisp. Towards the edge of the frame, rather than kind of having full-on wings, we just have a little bit of triangle effect. And so, I mean, it's not flawless. I have seen better results in this. But at the same time, I think that this is actually a fairly good control of chroma, and so obviously a very useful zoom lens for shooting the night sky, and I certainly would do it if you own the lens. We've got a galaxy captured here in this image, and while I don't know what it is, I know in my audience there are some smarty pants who is going to tell me what exactly that galaxy is there. Now, as I noted there for stills, I got, you know, pretty good, I thought, flare resistance. But if I shoot video and I have the bright sun right in the frame, things are not so pretty, as you can see here. And so flare, despite all the fancy coatings that are on this, flare can and certainly will be an issue under certain conditions. And so again, less of a problem for stills, I found, but for video where you're actually panning across the sun, there's certainly quite a bit of potential for getting ghosting artifacts as a part of that. So just something to be aware of. Also, if you're a JPEG shooter, you can use Canon's lens optimizer in camera, and it really corrects for all of those aberrations in camera and gives you really clean looking JPEGs. If you're a RAW shooter, however, none of those things make any difference. You're going to have to do the steps as I showed you in post and apply that profile or do other corrections to get the end result that you want. And so at the end of the day, as I noted, this is an expensive lens. And so it's expensive enough that it's not going to be for everyone. And, I did a little bit of comparison to a much less expensive lens, the Samyang AF, a 14mm f2.8. And so it's a little bit wider. It's not going to be as flexible, same maximum aperture, but it's much smaller, it's much cheaper. For some people, it's going to get the job done. And so there aren't a lot of options yet on the platform, but of course, there are some options, and even adapting something like the Tamron 15-30mm f2.8 G2 could be a good option as well. However, if you want a native mount zoom lens that has Canon's top grade build and performance, this is the guy right now on the platform, and obviously it is a lens that has packed a lot into, not a small lens, but definitely packed a lot into this package. And if you're coming from EF on Canon and you're comparing this lens to the 16-35mm, it's kind of a no-brainer. You're getting that image stabilizer, you're getting the extra millimeter of width, and you're only paying $100 more comparatively. So all things considered, that makes it a relatively good value, though for many people it's still going to be maybe too expensive to be for their consideration. At the end of the day, obviously you know your budget and you know your shooting needs. You know how often maybe a lens like that is actually going to get used, and you're going to have to make a value estimate based upon your real-world needs. It's certainly a lens that I think is professional grade and will get the job done, and obviously can produce beautiful images, as you can see here, but it's not going to be for everyone. It's not in everyone's budget, and that's always been true of Canon's pro-grade lenses. And so at the end of the day, you're a consumer, you get to vote with your wallet. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review, also linkage to the image gallery if you want to check out photos from the lens. And beyond that, there are buying links there if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. Also linkage to follow me on social media, to become a patron, or to sign up for my newsletter. And if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.